They were called better women. That's how the locals described those who returned from the convent of eternal tears, transformed, composed, and eerily serene. But behind their placid smiles and hollow eyes lay something far more unsettling. Hannah Morris was among the first. Sent to the convent after falling into melancholia following the death of her infant son, she returned just 3 months later with a smile so fixed it unsettled her neighbors. When shown her baby's clothes, she stared at them with polite confusion as if they belonged to someone else. She claimed to have no memory of ever giving birth, no recollection of the child who had once consumed her every waking thought. That chapter of her life had been erased. Then came Elizabeth Thornton, the wife of a respected merchant. She had been committed after a scandal publicly accusing her husband of adultery and demanding a divorce. Her behavior was labeled hysterical, dangerous to the family's standing. When she returned 4 months later, her fiery accusations were gone. She insisted she had never said such things. Her marriage, she now claimed, was perfectly happy. Her husband, a man beyond reproach. But her body told another story. Elizabeth began suffering from crippling headaches that kept her bedridden for days. She would forget the names of friends she had known for decades, get lost in her own neighborhood, and struggle with simple tasks: setting a table, writing her name. Worse still, she bore strange scars on her scalp. When asked how she got them, she simply shrugged. She didn't remember. None of them did. One by one, the women returned, their spirits subdued, their memories fragmented, their personalities muted, and each of them, without exception, bore the same unexplained, marks, thin, crescent-shaped scars hidden beneath their hair. The people of Milbridge had no language for it then, but today we would recognize them for what they were: surgical, deliberate, precise, and only the beginning. Dr. Samuel Hartwell was once a man of reputation, a respected physician and public advocate for the Convent of Eternal Tears. He called their work a triumph of modern medicine and spiritual healing. But as the years wore on, so too did the weight of what he had witnessed. His public support never wavered, but privately, the doctor was unraveling. He drank heavily, muttering to himself about progress and the necessary price of discovery. Those close to him noticed the change's eyes no longer steady, his hands trembling even as he signed medical referrals that sent more women into the convent's care. After his death, Hartwell's journals revealed a chilling confession pages filled with frantic handwriting, moral anguish, and scientific awe. The procedures I have witnessed challenge every principle of medical ethics I was taught, he wrote. Yet the results are undeniable. He documented what modern science would later recognize as early lobotomies: direct manipulation of brain tissue to suppress memory, modify personality, and erase behaviors deemed undesirable. The Ashford sisters, he claimed, were achieving what European physicians had only dared to theorize, and he had helped them do it. Their methods were surgical, their documentation meticulous. Each woman was a case study, recorded before and after, measured not just in symptoms, but in obedience, conformity, and emotional dullness. Hartwell called it behavioral refinement, but what they were truly perfecting was control. As shipments of surgical tools and chemical compounds arrived from across Europe and reports were sent back in return, the convent's halls echoed with a strange fusion of prayer and experimentation. Women entered in distress. They left with their memories stripped, their identities altered. And through it all, Dr. Hartwell remained the face of legitimacy, a man who had traded his conscience for progress and whose silence made him complicit in something unspeakable. They came home smiling. That's what the neighbors always said. The women who returned from the Convent of Eternal Tears arrived back to their families transformed, not healed, not restored, transformed. Take the case of Hannah Morse, a young mother from Bangor. She had been sent to the convent following the tragic death of her infant son. Diagnosed with melancholia, her grief was too loud, too unladylike. 3 months later, she returned home cheerful, and naturally cheerful, with a blank expression and a disturbing serenity in her eyes. When her husband showed her their son's belongings, the tiny socks, the wooden rattle she had carved herself, Hannah stared at them as if she were seeing them for the first time. No tears, no confusion, nothing. When asked about her son, she simply replied, "I never had a child." The neighbors thought it strange, the way she smiled without emotion, the way she stood still for long periods of time, as if waiting for a command. But in those days, a quiet woman was a good woman. Her husband, embarrassed by the scrutiny, insisted Hannah had been cured. Then there was Elizabeth Thornton, a merchant's wife, who had caused a scandal by publicly accusing her husband of infidelity. She'd demanded a divorce. In 1805, such an act was considered the height of hysteria. She was swiftly committed to the convent under the guise of moral reformation. When Elizabeth returned 4 months later, the transformation was complete. She had retracted her accusations, claimed she had never spoken them. "My husband," she said with a soft, mechanical voice, "is a man of God. I must have been mistaken." But her condition was far from improved. Elizabeth suffered severe headaches that left her bedridden for days. She forgot familiar faces, wandered through her home as if it were unfamiliar territory. At times, she couldn't recall her own name. Her family whispered behind closed doors she was not the woman they had sent away. She was a ghost in her own skin. And she wasn't alone. Dozens of women emerged from the convent, changed in similar ways, scarred and subdued. The pattern became undeniable. Mothers who forgot their children, daughters who no longer dreamed, wives who returned docile, malleable, content to sit in silence and obey. They all had the same marks, thin white scars running along their scalps, partially hidden beneath their hair. When asked about the marks, the women simply said they didn't know. "Perhaps I fell," many of them said in unison, the exact same words. But their families knew better. They saw the way these women flinched at loud noises, the way they looked to others for approval before speaking, the way they struggled with things they once did with ease, reading, sewing, even cooking a familiar dish. And yet, no one spoke out. Why? Because the convent was revered. Because Dr. Hartwell endorsed them, and that gave the operation credibility. Because in a society that punished defiance in women, a place that corrected rebellious daughters and hysterical wives was seen not as a prison, but a solution. The convent's reputation only grew. The Ashford sisters began charging higher fees for their comprehensive reform program, up to $500 per patient, a fortune at the time. Wealthy families from Boston, New York, even Charleston, sent their troubled women north, eager to erase embarrassment from their bloodlines. Behavioral modification became a commodity, and the price? Memory, autonomy, identity. The community whispered, but no one interfered, not when the results were so convenient. What's more chilling, perhaps, is that some of these women were never seen again. Their families were told they had experienced such profound spiritual awakening that they had chosen to remain as permanent residents, devoting their lives to prayer and silence. But when family members tried to visit, they were turned away. "They have taken vows of seclusion," the sisters would say. "They can no longer engage with the outside world." Behind those stone walls, no one knew what was happening. But then came Martha Goodwin, a mother who would not stay silent. Her daughter, Rebecca, had been sent to the convent for what the doctor called difficult temperament. The girl had been headstrong, independent, too intelligent for her own good. After 6 months, she returned docile, agreeable, and hollow. Martha sensed something was wrong. Her daughter answered questions too slowly, laughed at the wrong times, repeated phrases that felt rehearsed. So Martha began asking questions, quietly, carefully. She reached out to other families, gathering stories like hers, and a pattern emerged. All the women who had undergone intensive treatment in the convent's basement facilities remembered almost nothing about their stay, just fragmented prayers, snatches of hymns. Their entire treatment period was a void, and some women had never come home at all. When Martha asked where these daughters had gone, she was told the same line: "They've chosen a life of seclusion." But the mothers never received letters. The sisters refused all visits, and no one could prove they were even alive. The truth was beginning to crack through the surface. As more women came forward with their accounts, strange scars, missing time, lost memories, the illusion began to unravel. But it would take one woman's escape from the heart of the operation to tear the veil off completely. And that woman was Sarah Whitman. Her arrival at the convent would mark the beginning of the end. But before we uncover her incredible story of resistance and survival, ask yourself this: if a woman returned to you smiling, silent, and strange, would you know the difference between healing and erasure? She was not like the others. From the moment Sarah Whitman stepped through the iron gates of the Convent of Eternal Tears, the Ashford sisters knew something was wrong, or rather something was different. She wasn't shattered, she wasn't meek, she didn't look away in shame or tremble when addressed. Her back was straight, her gaze direct, her voice clear, and that made her dangerous. Sarah was 24 years old, the daughter of a wealthy Boston merchant family. She had grown up in a world of luxury and refinement, but also one of rigid rules and suffocating expectations. When Sarah became pregnant out of wedlock, her family was horrified. She refused to name the father protecting a man who, some whispered, had been far more powerful than she was. She wouldn't agree to a quiet marriage, nor did she accept her parents' arrangement to send the child away. She wanted to raise her baby, alone, as a mother and as a woman who refused to apologize for her choices. That, in 1819, was unforgivable. Declared unstable, labeled as suffering from moral inversion and unfeminine obstinacy, Sarah was sent north, committed to the Ashford convent under the guise of therapeutic reformation. Her family paid well. They wanted results. A quiet, compliant daughter, a woman with her edges smoothed away. But Sarah was not broken. She had been educated beyond what was typical for a woman of her time. Her father, ironically, had once encouraged her intellect, allowing her access to books and medical journals, hoping she'd make a good impression on intelligent suitors. Now that knowledge would save her life. The convent, with its towering gray stone, iron fences, and ever-silent halls, exuded an aura of peace. But Sarah saw it for what it was, a machine for stripping identity. On her first day, she was taken to an interview room lined with icons of saints and suffering. Three sisters sat across from her, Agatha, Prudence, and Temperance. They asked no questions about her soul. No prayers were said for her child. Instead, they measured the circumference of her skull, tested her pupils' reactions to light, asked her to solve memory puzzles and name objects rapidly. This was not a spiritual refuge. This was a lab. The sisters referred to her as Subject 611. She was told she would undergo a 6-month reformation. They offered no further explanation. Sarah played along at first. She smiled. She answered their questions. She memorized the layout of the rooms, the number of guards, the shift changes. She noted where the shadows fell longest at night, which floorboards creaked, which windows remained unlocked. She also observed the others. The women around her shells of people walked the halls like marionettes. Their faces were blank, their speech slowed. Some muttered prayers under their breath, over and over like broken music boxes. All had that same scar just beneath the hairline. The convent had rules, but none were holy. Every action had a purpose. Meals were timed. Social interactions were restricted. Days were spent in isolation and repetition. Then the real treatment began. Sarah was placed into what they called conditioning. Sister Temperance oversaw this phase. It began with solitary confinement, days in a lightless cell where her food was reduced and her sleep interrupted by loud banging on the walls. Then came sensory manipulation, streams of hot and cold, bright lights followed by darkness, overwhelming smells designed to induce nausea or dizziness. She was asked the same questions repeatedly. Do you regret your behavior? Do you believe you are unwell? Will you let us help you become good? She never gave them what they wanted. When her answers didn't change, they moved to psychological dismantling, verbal abuse, degradation. They told her she was an embarrassment, a disgrace to womanhood, that her child was better off dead than being raised by her. Sarah endured it, all stone-faced. She began writing, secretly, at night. She made ink from crushed berries and scraps of food. She hid pieces of parchment beneath the mattress, inside her sleeves, stitched into the hem of her undergarments. She documented everything, procedures, routines, names, dates. She knew something terrible was happening in the basement levels areas no patient was ever allowed to see. Women disappeared into that part of the convent and came back less. Some didn't return at all. Then came the storm. A spring thunderstorm flooded the lower floors in March of 1819. Equipment had to be moved, patients had to be relocated, order dissolved into chaos. And chaos was Sarah's opportunity. She overpowered a young novice sent to escort her to a different chamber. In the confusion, she slipped through the hallway and down the stairs into the forbidden level. What she found there shattered any lingering doubts. There were operating tables fitted with leather restraints, jars of preserved brain tissue floating in chemicals, cabinets filled with surgical instruments she recognized from the anatomy texts she had studied as a teenager, and on the wall charts, drawings, notes, cold clinical observations of personality changes, diagrams showing which parts of the brain were removed to suppress memory, reduce speech, eliminate sexual desire. She opened a drawer and found records, hundreds of them. Margaret Fowler treated for excessive reading and intellectual curiosity. Procedure: resection of frontal lobes. Outcome: vocabulary reduced by 70%. Obsession with books successfully eliminated. Rebecca Goodwin subjected to 3 procedures to reduce defiance. Outcome: domestic compliance achieved. Emotional flattening evident. Sarah's stomach turned. She stuffed what documents she could into a dress and fled back upstairs before anyone noticed her absence. She knew she had only days left. Her time for full treatment was approaching. The sisters were growing suspicious of her resistance. She heard them whispering during meal service. She noticed that Sister Prudence had started watching her more closely. Her final chance came just before dawn on April 3rd, 1819, a moonless night. She took a metal rod she had smuggled from the storm-damaged basement and attacked the guard who brought her water. She ran through the woods, barefoot, cold. The Ashford sisters organized the manhunt within the hour. Local men joined the search, told they were looking for a deranged woman who had escaped her treatment and might harm herself. Sarah heard them shouting. She hid beneath a fallen log. She swallowed rainwater. She ate wild roots and tree bark. On the third day, she found salvation. A trapper named Joshua Meadows was checking his snares when he saw a half-mad, mud-covered woman stumble into his path. At first, he thought she was delirious, until she began reciting with crystal clarity names, surgical terms, the convent's blueprints, and medical procedures no uneducated woman could know. Her wounds were real, her terror undeniable, and most importantly, she had documents. Meadows gave her food, boots, warmth. He brought her to Sheriff William Hawthorne in the nearby town of Millbridge. Sarah collapsed in his office. Her story spilled out not wild accusations, but precise clinical observations. She drew the convent's layout from memory. She described the location of surgical records. She handed him the notes she had hidden against her skin. And for the first time in 20 years, someone listened. The sheriff organized a raid. But what they found inside the convent of eternal tears would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What was supposed to be a refuge for broken women was a laboratory, a prison, a tomb. The Ashford sisters had fled, but they left behind enough to damn them forever. Operating tables, jars of human brains, corpses floating in alcohol, and a paper trail. Thousands of documents detailing every cut, every injection, every ruined life. The world would try to forget what Sarah exposed. Officials sealed the records. Families stayed silent. The convent was burned to the ground. But Sarah had cracked the illusion. One woman, armed only with knowledge, courage, and a mind that refused to break. In our next chapter, we uncover what investigators found inside the convent's wall sand, the horrifying truth about who the Ashford sisters really were. The convent of eternal tears was no sanctuary. It was a factory for forgetting, a cathedral for cruelty. And Sarah Whitman, she was the woman who escaped hell and made the world listen. The morning of May 20th, 1819, dawned gray and heavy over the pines of rural Maine. Sheriff William Hawthorne stood at the head of a 15-man posse armed, each grim-faced, each about to witness a horror that none of them were prepared for. The convent of eternal tears, for 2 decades, seen as a sacred refuge for troubled women, loomed in silence ahead. Its spires cut the sky like the fingers of a dead god. But something was wrong. The iron gate was open, no bells tolled. No sisters greeted them with strange smiles and carefully chosen words. The convent was abandoned. The Ashford sisters, Agatha, Prudence, Temperance were gone, and what they left behind would burn itself into American history like a brand. Inside, the first floor appeared undisturbed. Prayer benches, iconography, a faint smell of incense lingered, as if pretending piety still lived here. But there were no voices, no footsteps, no eyes behind veils. The sanctuary was still until they found the basement. Behind a sealed door previously off-limits to any visitor not approved by the sisters, they forced entry with axes. What lay beyond that door was not a place of faith. It was a laboratory of the damned. The men descended the stairs and were hit by a wave of chemical stench preservatives, alcohol, blood. The first chamber was lined with surgical instruments, carefully arranged, not rusted or forgotten used recently, bone saws, skull drills, hooks and scalpels and clamps designed not for healing but for alteration. A massive operating table sat at the center of the room, with leather restraints on all 4 corners. Bloodstains still marred its iron edges. On the walls, charts and diagrams, anatomical sketches of the human brain, not copied from medical texts, but drawn from first-hand study, hundreds of them. Each illustration was labeled with subject numbers. Many featured female heads, open at the crown, with colored markings showing areas to be removed, severed, or cauterized. Each note described what behavioral deviations had been eliminated. Subject 404. Excessive sexual ideation. Procedure. Partial ablation of anterior cingulate cortex. Result. Subject now displays sexual aversion and improved modesty. Subject 512. Chronic melancholia. Trepanning followed by cortical suppression. Result. Subject displays unnatural cheerfulness, complete memory suppression of prior trauma. And then came the next door. It was hidden behind a false wall, discovered only when one of the sheriff's men noticed the seam didn't line up with the floor molding. When they broke it open, what greeted them made even the hardest of them recoil. 47 bodies, suspended in glass vats, preserved in chemical solutions. They floated in silence, eyes closed as sometimes, mouths open in mid-scream. Every corpse bore clear signs of cranial surgery, shaven scalps, sutured incisions, bone removed and never replaced. Each tank had a tag, name, procedure, date, and outcome. Some had been dead for years, others only weeks. Sarah Whitman had been right. These weren't treatments, these were experiments. One corpse stood out, a young woman no older than 18, whose procedure tag read, Subject 601, refractory, multiple failures, final disposition, preservation. She had tried to resist and paid the price. Behind them, an old filing cabinet revealed the final piece of the puzzle. Thousands of pages of documentation, names, family contacts, financial records, and correspondence with institutions all over the world. It was not just the sisters. The convent had been the heart of a global network. Letters from Vienna, Berlin, Paris, Edinburgh, researchers begging for data, offering gold, reputation, even protection in return for the information the Ashford sisters were collecting. And the Ashford sisters delivered. Their files were extensive, surgical outcomes cross-referenced with personality changes, follow-up reports from families, notes on how long different procedures took to erase memories, suppress empathy, or eliminate rebellious thoughts. They had even cataloged the failure rates, marking deaths, behavioral regressions, and unintended outcomes. They were not healers. They were scientists, yes, but also butchers, engineers of the human mind, and businesswomen who sold the results to the highest bidder. It was a factory, a personality factory where your daughter could be sent for melancholia and return docile, obedient, her memories rewritten, or gone entirely. Sheriff Hawthorne knew then this could not be kept local. He sent dispatches to Boston and Portland, demanding federal marshals, and that's when he interrogated the final loose thread, Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the physician who had once spoken so highly of the sisters, the one who had sent patients to them, who had written letters praising their work, who had even published medical articles about transformational therapies for hysteria. Now confronted with the bodies, the evidence, and the preserved brain matter, Dr. Hartwell could no longer hide behind academic rhetoric. He broke. Under heavy guard in Millbridge jail, Hartwell confessed what he had long hidden. The Ashford sisters were not nuns. They were doctors, renegade scientists, banned from practicing in Europe. Mother Superior Agatha was once Dr. Agatha Brennan, expelled from Scotland after multiple asylum patients died during her experimental surgeries. Sister Prudence had been Dr. Prudence Ashford, a neuroanatomist obsessed with mapping female emotional responses to specific brain regions. Temperance Science, Dr. Temperance Ashford had been her student, a prodigy in psychological conditioning. They had come to America under new names, in new robes, with a plan, create a space with no oversight, no scrutiny, no laws. The convent was never holy. It was built to house their experiments, a lie draped in robes and prayer. The Ashford sisters had been preparing for years. Bank accounts discovered under multiple aliases revealed over 50, zero in modern equivalent funds, scattered through Canada, Mexico, and Europe. Shipping records from nearby ports showed crates of equipment, surgical instruments, preserved tissue, and confidential reports had been sent to international destinations for years, slowly, quietly. They had known their time would come, and they were ready. By the time authorities had enough to issue warrants, the sisters were gone. No witnesses, no clues. The convent burned down by terrified locals soon after left no holy remains, only ashes, and the whispers of a generation of women silenced by science in a nun's habit. Sarah Whitman's evidence formed the backbone of the federal investigation. But it wasn't just her voice. It was the cold facts, the records, the bodies, the jars, the files, the letters. Everything was real. Everything had happened, and still the world went quiet. Why? Because what Sarah exposed wasn't just three mad women in a convent. It was a mirror, a reflection of how easily a society will sacrifice its most vulnerable when the promise of progress is dangled in front of it. It revealed how women's minds were seen as problems to solve, rather than lives to nurture. It revealed how medical advancement, when untethered from ethics, becomes a tool of control. The files were sealed, the investigation buried, officials feared scandal, families feared shame, so they let it disappear, quietly, but not entirely, because even as the convent's ruins cooled, even as federal records vanished into locked archives, even as townsfolk vowed never to speak of it again, the knowledge had already spread. The Ashford sisters' procedures, their diagrams, their experiments, muggled across oceans, translated into textbooks, whispered in lecture halls under different names, Medical schools in Europe began teaching techniques that unknown to most were born in the basement of a convent. And somewhere far from Maine, in a city where no one knew the truth, the Ashford sisters may have continued their work. New names, new disguises, but the same ambition to master the human mind, to silence disobedience, to control the soul on incision at a time. Coming up in our next chapter, what happened to the 600 women whose names were found in the convent's registry? How many of them survived, and what did they remember? Subscribe now and follow us into the next part of this true historical horror where memory itself became the battlefield. The registry was discovered folded neatly in a locked drawer beneath the convent's chapel floorboard sink, still legible, as if waiting patiently to be read. A thick, leather-bound ledger of clinical precision and terrifying finality. 612 names, each one a woman, each one catalogued with notes on treatment type, dates of admission and discharge, and a final annotation that sealed their fate. Some were labeled reformed and returned, others permanent resident, and the rest expired. At a glance, it might have looked like the logs of a hospital, but reading between the lines, the truth revealed itself. These weren't patients, they were subjects. Test cases in a grotesque scientific pursuit, and their stories were nearly lost to time. Of the 612 women, 247 were marked reformed and returned, 166 listed as permanent residents, and 199 as expired, a word that in Ashford terminology meant dead. Dead from surgery, dead from trauma, or deliberately preserved. Authorities tried to track the reformed women. Investigators followed their names, asked families, visited towns, but what they found chilled them. Many of the returned women no longer resembled the people their families had once known. Their memories had been erased, their personalities flattened into obedience. Some couldn't recall their own children, others didn't recognize siblings or hometowns. One woman, previously a gifted pianist, stared blankly at a keyboard, unsure of its purpose. In towns across New England, women sat in parlors or kitchens, folding laundry or stirring stew, soulless shadows of who they had once been. One mother described her daughter's return. She smiles now. She agrees with everything, but she's not there. Her eyes, they're empty, and she calls me ma'am instead of mother. Another family reported that their daughter, once an outspoken writer, came home unable to read more than a few lines without complaining of headaches. Her journal entries, once lively with poetry, were reduced to single-line notes like laundry done. No thoughts today. What was worse known of these women remembered the convent. If pressed, they'd speak of vague prayers, incense, moments of reflection, but never the procedures, never the straps, never the drills or the scalpels or the sisters in blood-stained robes. It was as if the pain had been surgically extracted along with their autonomy. Investigators began quietly collecting testimonies. Yet something sinister emerged. Families didn't want the truth. Most parents, husbands, and brothers denied that anything unusual had happened. To accept that their loved ones had been mutilated in secret in the name of science and social conformity would be to admit complicity. Many had paid for the treatment themselves. Many had signed the commitment forms. Some had celebrated the change. They called it a miracle, and so the silence grew louder. The second group, the 166 permanent residents, were even more mysterious. The sisters had claimed these women had taken vows of silence and seclusion, choosing to remain as nuns in training, cloistered away from the world. But when the convent was searched, no such women were found. No private quarters, no prayer cells, no evidence of living space beyond what the sisters themselves used. Some investigators believe these women were buried secretly in the forest, victims of failed procedures or deemed unfit for release. Others suspected they were the bodies found preserved in basement chambers, tagged with clinical detachment. In truth, no one knows. No graves were found, no markers, just names in a ledger and silence. Then came the 199 marked expired. Some died on the table, others days later, after infection or seizures or brain swelling, but a fraction had been preserved specimens in jars and tanks. Sheriff Hawthorne's report noted, each body was treated with the same attention one might give a specimen frog, tagged, recorded, stored. Postmortem records revealed horrifying notes. Subject 233, expired 48 hours post-op, partial removal of hippocampus, observed extreme disorientation prior to cardiac failure. Subject 317, expired during anesthesia, brain removed for longitudinal study. Subject 601, multiple interventions, no response, preserved for analysis. These weren't deaths. These were sacrifices, and still nothing was done because what followed was not justice. It was cover up. After only 6 months, the federal investigation was officially closed. No charges, no trials, no manhunt for accomplices. The Ashford sisters, already vanished, were quietly written off as fugitives from local jurisdiction. And all the fillers sealed. Why? The answer lies in the letters. Hundreds of them, from universities, hospitals, government medical boards, some expressing shock, others curiosity, but more than a few showed clear collusion. They'd received data from the sisters for years, bought diagrams, replicated techniques, taught them. To expose the convent fully would be to expose themselves. The system had profited from the Ashford experiments, and now it buried them. What happened next was grotesque in its irony. The knowledge was saved. While the women were buried or forgotten, their pain erased by public shame, the science lived on. Procedures pioneered in the convent became foundational in early neurology. The sisters' diagrams were anonymously referenced in British medical journals. Their conditioning techniques influenced early psychiatric asylums across Europe. By the late 1800s, similar methods stripped of their horrific origins were taught in medical schools under different names. No credit to Agatha or Prudence or Temperance, of course. No mention of the women sacrificed for those pages of discovery. The ledger remained hidden in a federal archive until 1941, when a historian researching 19th century asylums stumbled upon it. It was dismissed as likely apocryphal. Not a single victim received justice, and yet there was one voice, one woman who refused silence. Sarah Whitman. Though she was never the same, she lived. She testified, she wrote, she named names, and she paid the price. Estranged from her family, labeled hysterical, she moved west, settling in California under a false name. There, she worked quietly as a teacher, never married, never forgot. In 1863, shortly before her death, she penned her memoir, Beneath the Veil, My Life Inside the Convent of Eternal Tears. It was never published in her lifetime. Too dangerous, too unbelievable. But it remains, stored in a private collection at a small historical society. Its pages yellowed, its spine cracked. Within it, Sarah tells everything. The moment she arrived, the surgeries she witnessed, the women she tried to help, the night she escaped, barefoot and bleeding, with only truth in her hands. And in her final entry, she writes, If this truth dies with me, let it not be because it was not spoken. Let the world know what happened in those holes. Let no woman be forgotten. And now, not all horror wears the mask of monsters. Sometimes it kneels in prayer. Sometimes it wears a white coat. Sometimes it speaks in the language of progress. But behind it all is a scalpel and silence. In the next part of this true story, where did the Ashford sisters go? Did they continue their work? And was a certain clinic in 1850's Paris just another convent in disguise? Subscribe now, and we'll follow the trail. When the convent doors were kicked open in the spring of 1819, the Ashford sisters had already vanished into the trees. No witnesses, no final goodbyes, no bodies. Only a trail of footprints in the damp forest floor and a legacy soaked in blood and brilliance. Despite the exhaustive manhunt that followed, they were never seen in Maine again. But their story did not end there. The Ashford legacy would continue to haunt the corridors of medical science and darken the pages of secret reports across the Atlantic. The vanishing begins. Sheriff William Hawthorne issued arrest warrants for all three women, naming them fugitives in connection with over 600 counts of unlawful imprisonment, unlicensed surgery, and manslaughter. Within weeks, federal marshals joined the search. Wanted posters spread from Maine to New York, offering a 5-0 bounty dead or alive. But the sisters were too clever, too prepared. It became clear during the investigation that their escape had been in motion long before Sarah Whitman's breakout. Hidden passageways within the convent led to underground tunnels, some stretching nearly a mile into the forest. Maps recovered from the site indicated pre-planned exit routes, rendezvous locations, and even coded references to offshore transit. Bank documents uncovered in Millbridge pointed to a more disturbing truth. For over 5 years, the Ashford sisters had been transferring money to foreign accounts, some in Montreal, others in Lisbon, Amsterdam, and Buenos Aires. The total sum exceeded 50. Adjusted for modern inflation, that's over 10 million. But it wasn't just money they had exported. According to port records from Boston and Portland, the sisters had also shipped dozens of large crates marked medical instruments, preserved anatomical samples, and religious literature. None were ever recovered. The South American theory. By 1821, rumors began to spread of three English-speaking women operating a remote clinic in northern Argentina. A missionary passing through the town of Salta wrote in his journal, "There is a strange house on the hillside, run by three aging ladies of impeccable discipline and medical knowledge. Locals say they cure women of madness, but no one knows where their patients go afterward." The description of the women matched that of the Ashford sisters, though the missionary had no idea who they were. By the time an American official was dispatched to investigate the rumor in 1823, the facility had been abandoned. Furniture remained. So did some tools, but the women were gone. The Paris sighting. In Mille with Kent a Hannah a Chouek, a French neurologist named Dr. Alphonse Dubois, claimed in a private letter to colleagues that he had encountered a British woman practicing under the alias Dr. Hélène Brunet. She was operating a private salon in Paris, treating upper-class women for nervous afflictions, using unorthodox methods. He wrote, "Her techniques resemble those rumored to be practiced in the Maine wilderness. She speaks softly, with the calm authority of a nun, and her knowledge of brain anatomy is unparalleled." Before authorities could act, the woman vanished. Her apartment was found, empty papers burned, instruments gone, her patients instructed to say nothing. No one ever saw her again. False names, real influence. The Ashford sisters had planned not only for escape, but for survival. They knew how to change their names, forge documents, and move across borders. Evidence suggests they rotated aliases over the years. Agatha Brennan became Mother Miriam in Canada, then Dr. Hélène Brunet in France. Prudence Ashford used the name Eliza Trent while boarding a ship to Mexico in 1831. Temperance, the youngest, may have traveled to Italy, where rumors of a mysterious English woman experimenting with mental conditioning in Florence's underground medical scene emerged in the 1840s. Each time, by the time authorities caught wind of a lead, the trail was cold. The medical legacy? As horrifying as their crimes were, the Ashford sisters' impact on medical science cannot be ignored. Their procedures painful, unethical, grotesque were also decades ahead of their time. The sisters had documented their techniques in meticulous detail, how cutting a specific segment of the frontal lobe reduced aggression, how damaging the hippocampus erased memory while preserving speech, how sensory deprivation after surgery could permanently reshape behavior. These records, secretly copied and sold, made their way into the libraries of European institutions. The University of Edinburgh, which had once expelled Prudence Ashford, unknowingly incorporated diagrams from her experiments into their anatomy courses by 1870. Even the emerging field of lobotomy in the 20th century would mirror techniques first described in the Ashford logs. It's a bitter irony that the knowledge born in torture became part of accepted science. Perhaps the most chilling chapter of this story is not the sisters' escape, but the world's reaction after. After the initial scandal, there was no widespread outcry, no public trials, no lasting reform. Families silenced the truth. Communities burned what was left. Churches quietly distanced themselves from the convent, rewriting its history as a failed charitable mission. One newspaper in Boston described the convent tragedy with this dismissive headline, "Unfortunate misunderstanding at women's sanatorium." Behind closed doors, however, men in power knew exactly what had happened. Correspondence recovered in the late 20th century revealed that several hospitals and universities had chosen to seal their letters with the sisters rather than risk exposure. Some even returned documentation along with polite notes. "While we found your recent submissions of great interest, the current political climate makes it impossible for us to continue this exchange. Please destroy all previous communications." In a moment when the world could have faced the horror it helped create, it chose cowardice. Sarah's final stand. Only one voice persisted, Sarah Whitman's. After years of isolation, she completed her memoir in 1863, knowing she didn't have long to live. In it, she detailed every moment inside the convent, every name she could remember, every instrument, every scream. She wrote not for fame, but for truth. "Let no one say this was legend," she wrote. "Let no girl enter a hospital in fear, without knowing who came before her. What was done to us will happen again if no one remembers." Sarah died a year later, unknown and forgotten by her contemporaries. But her memoir was preserved by a young student she once meant to read, a woman who, in 1911, donated the manuscript to a fledgling women's history archive in California. That single act ensured the story was not lost forever. The convent today. All that remains of the convent of eternal tears is a foundation, now overgrown with moss and pine. Locals say the land is cursed, animals avoid it, and even hikers feel uneasy there. A small plaque, erected in 1986, stands at the edge of the property, in memory of the unknown women who suffered here. Their names were not forgotten. Their silence was not in vain. And yet, despite all we now know, questions remain. How many other convents or clinics operated in similar secrecy? How many daughters were taken with promises of healing and returned hollow? And what happened to the Ashford sisters, whose knowledge lived on even if their faces vanished? Perhaps they died in exile, perhaps they were murdered by co-conspirators, or perhaps their teachings were passed down, whispered in shadows, hidden in plain sight, because even now, in some of the most elite medical archives, certain diagrams remain unattributed, precise, surgical, cold, exactly like theirs. In our final chapter, we'll follow the paper trail to its conclusion, uncovering how their data shaped the rise of early psychiatric institutions and how a new generation of women uncovered the truth nearly a century later. Subscribe, share this story, because the shadows of history still echo and some truths demand to be heard. They were gone. The convent burned to ash, the women buried or forever altered, and the Ashford sisters' phantoms scattered across continents, leaving behind only surgical scars and sealed records. But while the fire may have consumed the walls of the convent of eternal tears, it could not erase the ink of its horrors. Because the final act of this story wouldn't unfold in the 1800s. It would take nearly 100 years before the truth would claw its way out from government vaults, forgotten archives, and personal memoirs long buried in attics and basements. And when it did, it would change everything we thought we knew about early psychiatry, medical ethics, and the terrifying power of silence. The sealed files. After the Ashford sisters vanished in 1819, all official investigation was swiftly closed. Witnesses were discredited, documents locked away, and the sheriff's office instructed to speak of the case no further. Orders came from Boston, and then, strangely from Washington. The hundreds of pages found in the convent surgical diagrams, experimental logs, and names of deceased patients were shipped to a secure location. For decades, historians assumed they were destroyed. They weren't. In 1927, a junior clerk working for the Department of Public Health stumbled upon a box labeled Main Sanitarium, Irregular Case Materials, Restricted. Inside were over 200 handwritten documents, many signed with names that had once belonged to nuns, but were actually disgraced doctors: Brennan, Ashford, Temperance. The young clerk flagged the files, but instead of launching an investigation, his superior quietly relocated the box to a military medical facility archive in Maryland, citing sensitive content. It was filed under historical research, female mental institutions, pre-1850, and forgotten. Until a century later, the women who remembered. In the late 1950s, a new wave of feminist historians began uncovering discrepancies in the historical records of early American women's hospitals. One name surfaced again and again: the Convent of Eternal Tears, but no academic paper mentioned it in detail, only passing references, letters without authors, charts without names, diagrams without citations. It was Dr. Eleanor Gray, a neuroanatomist turned historian, who connected the dots. Gray had stumbled across Sarah Whitman's memoir preserved in a women's college archive in California. Something about the young woman's clinical descriptions caught Gray's attention. So she searched deeper, and in 1962, after nearly 4 years of lobbying, she was granted limited access to a sealed box at the Federal Medical Archives. What she found inside was worse than fiction. Pages and pages of precise anatomical sketches mapped like war plans, notations about how removing 2.3 centimeters of brain tissue from the parietal lobe eliminated romantic fantasizing in adolescent girls. Observations that infants born to experimental patients displayed reduced responsiveness to maternal contact. And worst of all, logs that listed patients not by names but by traits: too inquisitive, defiant, to husband, inclined to poetry, unmarried, 23. No prospects. These weren't women. They were problems to be fixed, filed, and forgotten. Dr. Gray published her findings anonymously in a limited circulation journal under the title Silent Scalpel: Notes on Prefrontal Alteration in 19th Century Female Treatment Facilities. Most readers dismissed it, but some didn't. Whispers in Modern Medicine. By the early 1970s, Researchers began noticing familiar patterns in early European psychiatric literature techniques attributed to French or German doctors bore uncanny resemblance to the Ashford notes. Even famed neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, mentor to Freud, had diagrams nearly identical to those found in the main convent. The layout, the terminology, the surgical access points. How? Because the Ashford sisters had sold their data to the very institutions that shaped modern psychiatry, a darker truth emerged. The roots of our mental health system were fertilized with blood and silence. Even the early pioneers of lobotomy, Moniz, Freeman, Watts, were drawing from concepts that had quietly spread through 19th century Europe like a virus, uncredited, undeniable. The Ashford sisters weren't fringe lunatics. They were the dark mothers of modern psychiatric surgery. The survivors speak, it took until the 1980s for the first surviving family members to come forward. Descendants of reformed women who had returned home docile, forgetful, and altered. One woman, Mary Alden, recounted how her grandmother, once a poet, returned from the convent unable to read or write. She spent the next 40 years knitting the same pattern over and over, smiling vacantly, never speaking above a whisper. Medical records from the time said she had suffered nervous collapse and been gently restored. In truth, she had been surgically lobotomized. Other families had kept even darker secrets. Boxes of hidden letters, burned journals, and one remarkable item, a preserved lock of hair, beneath which was a folded note reading, "From Rebecca, before they cut her. Keep this." These relics, along with newly unsealed files, allowed historians to reconstruct more than 200 patient profiles, each one a story of erasure. The unfinished work. Today, efforts continue to piece together the full legacy of the Ashford sisters, but many mysteries remain. Did they continue their work abroad? Did any of their patients escape and live to tell the truth? Was the Paris sighting real? Did Dr. Agatha Brennan die peacefully in a hidden salon, still believing she had saved women by cutting their minds apart? No one knows for sure. But researchers have uncovered chilling clues that suggest a broader network may have been involved, possibly including doctors in London, Vienna, and Buenos Aires who were replicating similar techniques under the guise of spiritual rehabilitation. Some believe the sisters passed on their knowledge direct through letters, medical apprenticeships, and hidden clinics disguised as religious retreats. One theory, still debated today, suggests that some surgical tools recovered from early Canadian rehabilitation centers bear inscriptions in Latin and Scottish Gaelic, the languages spoken by the Ashford sisters. It's as if their instruments outlived them and continued their work. What makes this story truly terrifying is not just what the Ashford sisters did, but how easily they were able to do it. Think about it. 3 women operating under false names, unlicensed, unregulated, performing hundreds of brain surgeries on vulnerable women, funded by medical institutions and protected by social taboos. For 21 years, they altered human lives undetected because their victims were inconvenient. Tu emocional, tu rebelius, tu dificulte. This wasn't just medical horror. It was social engineering designed to create a more agreeable womanhood. The scars weren't only in the skull, they were in the fabric of a culture that preferred obedience over authenticity. And perhaps that's why so many look the other way. Legacy in the shadows. The convent of eternal tears no longer exists. It burned, and the land was sold, then abandoned. But if you visit the woods outside Millbridge, Maine, some say you can still hear faint singing through the trees on certain nights. A low, choral hum-like prayer and weeping, tangled together. No building, no grave markers, just the earth trying to forget. And yet, even in forgetting, the story survives. Sarah Whitman's memoir, I Remember, the basement is now part of public historical archives, college courses dissected, museums cited. Survivors' families have started reunions, where they share their ancestors' stories in candlelit rooms. And the Ashford sisters? They live on in legend, in medicine, and in caution. A dark reminder that even the pursuit of healing, when stripped of ethics, can become the cruelest form of violence. And now we turn to you. What would you have done in 1819? Would you have trusted the convent? Sent your daughter? Believed the silence? Or would you have listened to the trembling voice of a girl who escaped with her mind and memory intact? If this story chilled you to your core, share it, pass it on. Let no one say it was ever forgotten, because somewhere, behind clean white walls and polished floors, echoes remain, and sometimes echoes grow louder.